The story of David versus Goliath is one of the most well-known stories in all of the Bible. It is a story of a young boy who slew a giant with just a sling and some stones. But what if I told you that the real story was actually much different than the story that we were taught when we were kids? Because there are many stories within the Bible that are symbolic or they have a deeper meaning that we can extract from them. And this is one of those stories. So today we're going to be looking at this story through an adult lens, and we're going to be looking at it like detectives and see what we can uncover. What kind of hidden truths are in here? Let's jump into it. The first thing that I want to point out is that this story takes place in a place called Elah Valley. Now, Elah means more than one valley. It can be referring to multiple valleys, but I am convinced that the author of this story is referring to something called the Valley of Elah. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at a map of Israel, and you look where the Israelites' camp was in that particular season, you will see that right outside of their camp was a valley called the Valley of Elah. That's where the battle took place. So now the question is, why was there a battle taking place? Well, the answer to that question is very simple. They were at war. The Philistines were at war with Israel. In fact, these two nations were arch enemies. They were always fighting each other. They were always going at each other's throats. So this wasn't the first time that these two nations had gone head to head. And so now the question is, who were the Philistines? Well, the Philistines were a nation located just south of Israel. They were neighbors of Israel, so it would make sense that they would be fighting each other, because they were so close to each other. But the Philistines weren't just any nation. They were a nation that hated Israel. They hated the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They despised the Israelites because they were the people of God, and they were always trying to wipe them off the face of the earth. In fact, when you read the book of Judges, you see that the oppression that was over Israel at that time was the oppression of the Philistines. They oppressed them, they beat them up, and they really tried to eradicate them. So the Philistines were sworn enemies of Israel. So now the question is, who was their champion? Their champion was this guy named Goliath. And the name Goliath comes from a Hebrew word which means he who is down, and I believe that's exactly who Goliath was. He was someone who was down, not physically, but spiritually. You see, throughout the Bible, we see that when people come against God's people, God allows them to win so that he can exalt himself. Throughout the Bible, we see that God allows the wicked to win sometimes so that he can expose his power. For example, when Job was tested by God, God allowed Satan to come against him. When Israel entered the promised land, they had to fight many battles to possess the land. Even when Jesus walked the earth, he didn't just heal everyone, he allowed some people to stay sick so that he could show forth his glory. So this was probably the case with Goliath. God probably allowed him to win battles so that he could showcase his own power. So now the question is, how did Israel respond to all of this? Well, they responded in fear. The entire army of Israel was afraid of Goliath. They were terrified of him. He intimidated them. He scared them. And day after day, he would just come out and yell at the Israelites and challenge them to send someone to fight him. And no one was willing. Every single person in Israel was afraid, except for one. There was one person who was not afraid. His name was David. Now, David wasn't just anyone. He was a young boy, a young shepherd. He was a young shepherd who watched his sheep. He spent all day long watching over his flock. But he wasn't just any shepherd. He was the son of Jesse. He was the son of a man named Jesse, who was part of the tribe of Judah, which was a direct descendant of King David, the future king of Israel. So David was not only a young shepherd, he was also royalty. He was a future king of Israel. And God chose him to take out Goliath. But David didn't have a weapon, he didn't have a sword, he didn't have a shield, he didn't have a spear. All he had was a sling and some stones. And the funny thing is that the sling and the stones that he used to kill Goliath is the same thing that he used to kill lions and bears. See? He was a shepherd. He had to protect his sheep from lions and bears, and he would use his sling and some stones to slay these animals. So the same thing that he used to slay a bear is the same thing he used to slay Goliath? Now, let's talk about the significance of that for a second, because the way that he killed the lion and the bear is the same way that he killed Goliath. What does that teach us? That teaches us that God doesn't need extraordinary people to get extraordinary things done. In fact, He uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And this is a pattern throughout the Bible. When you look at the Old Testament, you see that God chose David, a young shepherd boy, to slay Goliath. He chose Moses, a murderer, to deliver Israel from Egypt. He chose Gideon, a man who thought he was the least of his family, to deliver Israel from the Midianites. He chose Samson, a man who had a really messed up life and made some terrible decisions, to be the deliverer of Israel. So you see that God doesn't need extraordinary people to get extraordinary things done. He uses everyday people who put their faith in Him to accomplish His purposes. So David didn't need armor to defeat Goliath. He didn't need a sword. He didn't need a shield. All he needed was his faith in God and a sling and some stones. And that's all he had. But once he trusted God and he said, "Yes, God, I'm gonna do this," he went out there and he faced Goliath. Now, when David faced Goliath, the people around him, including his own brother Eliab, thought he was crazy. They thought he was out of his mind. They thought he had lost it. They thought he was stupid. They thought, why would he even try? This guy's gonna crush him. And they really tried to talk him out of it. They said, "Don't even bother, bro. Don't even go. This guy's gonna kill you." But he didn't listen to them. He knew that God was with him. He knew that God was going to give him the victory. So he went out there and he faced Goliath. And when he went out there and faced Goliath, he reminded Goliath that God was with him. He reminded Goliath that God was going to give him the victory. And then he just took a stone and he launched that stone with all of his might. And that stone hit Goliath right in the forehead. And Goliath fell to his death. So what's the lesson that we can learn from this story? The lesson we can learn from this story is that no matter how big the giant is, no matter how much bigger the giant seems than us, and no matter how many times the giant reminds us of how small we are, we can trust God to give us the victory. See? That's what David did. David knew that Goliath was a giant. He knew that he was much bigger than him. He knew that he had armor.
He knew that he had weapons.
And he knew that he was up against an entire nation. But David didn't allow that to stop him. He didn't allow that to intimidate him. He didn't allow that to scare him. He trusted God. And because he trusted God, God gave him the victory. And that's the same thing we have to do in our lives. No matter how big the giants are, no matter how much bigger the giants seem than us, and no matter how many times the giants remind us of how small we are, we can trust God to give us the victory. Because the truth is that we're not as small as you think we are. Yes, we may be small in our own strength. Yes, we may be weak on our own. Yes, we may be powerless without God. But when we tap into God's power, we become powerful. We become strong. We become conquerors. And we can do things that we never thought possible. So I challenge you today, no matter what giants you're facing, no matter how big they are, no matter how much bigger they seem than you, and no matter how many times they remind you of how small you are, I want you to remember that you are not as small as you think you are. You have the God of the universe on your side. You have the Most High, the Creator of the world, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, on your side. And if He be for us, who can be against us? I hope this video blessed you. If it did, make sure to leave us a thumbs up down below. Also, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, so that you can be notified every time we upload a new video.